2 of the series. Today we're going to attempt to do the practical part of the series. So that's going to involve some practical tests. So this is the fun part of the video series for me, because I get to shoot some arrows. Ultimately, what I'm wanting to achieve from this video is to run through the different components of the test, so the arrows, the target, the range, and actually film the test itself, and then we'll go through the results together and disclose how we're going to get the results, and I think that's going to be it for this video. This video is just purely going to be conducting the practical component of it, and yeah, taking our measurements, and that will set the scene for where we go from there, because we're going to have to discuss the results. So I suppose we should just get into it. The first thing that I want to go over is just a recap on the arrows again. So here's my 2 arrows, and if you watch the last video, you'll see how I've gone about creating 2 different arrows that are identical, with one heavier than the other. Look, straight off the bat, with the addition of the extra weight, this one I can feel, it feels a lot more solid. This is the 550 grain arrow, and as far as I'm aware, this is a pretty common weight to shoot in Australia, 500 grains plus. A lot of guys are choosing arrows like this to seek extra momentum, and therefore extra penetration when it comes to their target animals. This is the original arrow, which is, as we discussed in the last video, it's a 400 grain arrow, so it is quite light compared to what most other hunters are shooting in Australia. And again, you would go, well, you obviously haven't sought to get extra momentum with this one, but the minimum amount of weight you would shoot through a 70-pound bow would be 350 grains. So this is 50 grains heavier, which means technically it's safe to shoot through a bow, and it is a light arrow. So compared to this one, as I said before, I can feel the weight. We did measure them and record their weights, but you can definitely feel that this is a more solid arrow, just by feel. What the arrow difference is supposed to represent here is fundamentally, I'm trying to replicate what would happen with a hunter who's considering adding extra weight to their arrows to get better performance. And what this usually encompasses for the average hunter is speculation foremost. They perceive that they'll get better performance by adding extra weight to an arrow, and then they go online, read and watch a bunch of stuff, get some opinions together which will validate their choice to spend money and buy, you know, a bunch of heavier arrows, through the understanding that they'll have extra momentum, and then they take those arrows out into the field and shoot them, and perhaps they're lucky and they get some animals down, perhaps they're not, but that's generally the way things go. Is that, you know, if you're a hunter, you'll listen to what people have to say online about arrow weights and what's the optimum arrow weight and arrow build for hunting. And you'll see that there's a general consensus that there's a lot of people that are out there hunting with perhaps heavier arrows than what you would be given if you were to go and buy, say, the cheapest that are available on the market, which is usually what hunters get when they first start out hunting, and they start to have doubts in their setup, and then it leads them down the road of going and buying some better hunting arrows, and they just get heavier. Normally, just in Australia, they get heavier arrows. So what this is supposed to represent is a hunter that is perhaps wanting to add 150 grains to their setup, and rather than going out and buying a whole bunch of heavier arrows, This is going to represent what would happen if you were to add 150 grains, seeking greater momentum and greater penetration, without actually having to buy the arrows. So in my last video, I show you how to do that to your current arrows to see if adding, 150 grains to your setup would help you. And yeah, so it's just a cheap way to be able to test, replicate a heavier arrow and be able to measure the perceived benefits of it without actually having to go out and buy extra arrows. So the next thing that we're going to discuss is the target. So this guy here is the target that we'll be using for the test. As you can see, it's a collection of closed cell EVA foam mats. You can buy these from Bunnings. So what I do, I actually use this as this is how I build my targets all year round for training. And they're just, it costs about $100, and I go through maybe about 3 a year. So I just see, well, I don't see the point in me spending hundreds of dollars on targets, like professionally made targets, when I'm going to destroy them. I'm going to destroy them, and it's just going to cost me heaps of extra money, and I would prefer to see that money going into, actual hunts. So rather than just continuously buying expensive targets. Well, this setup and construction for a target does a number of things, as opposed to, say, those bag targets you can get where they're compressed plastic bags. What happens is when an arrow goes into those compressed plastic bags, it's not a uniform medium to shoot into. So there's like lots of air pockets and things like that inside those plastic bags, which would essentially mean that the arrow might stick into it on a funny angle. Whereas with these foam targets, whatever angle your arrow hits them on, it stays that way. It penetrates into the target. When you're using closed cell EVA foam mats, it penetrates into the target, which actually allows you to see which angle your arrow hit the target on as it gets to the target. And that's really good for being able to tune your bow, so that you can tune your arrow rest and your bow setup, so that it's hitting like straight every time it hits the target. It's a good indicator of, basically tail out, up or down when it hits the target. That's why I like to use these for tuning my bow. And also it allows me to draw whatever shapes I want on the front, so I can have it replicating a deer, or if I want, or I can make one that has just a straight line on it so that I can get my left to rights or my elevations. But in terms of this actual test and demonstration that we're going to do today, the reason this is a good choice, and as you can see, it's a fresh target. There's no holes in it whatsoever. So I've gone out and bought a brand new target for this, so that there can be no comments made that you shot into the same holes anywhere, and so it was not it's not measurable. So the reason that I'm choosing to use one of these for this demonstration is because of its uniform nature. So because it's uniform all the way through, same material all the way through, both arrows will be experiencing exactly the same amount of resistance. And so therefore the results that we're going to get are going to be measurable. I know that there's a lot of studies done on dead animals, where people shoot dead animals. I myself have done tests, broadhead testing on dead animals. I've even bought carcasses before to shoot my broadheads into to test and to see whether or not they're going to be a viable choice. That's just who I am. I won't go out into the field with any of my tools unless I've been able to first prove at home, using a measurable medium, to perceive that they're going to be being any benefit to the equipment that I've selected. So when I won't go out into the field unless I can see at home that there's been measurable benefit with my gear here on this. before I go and attempt to shoot it into an animal. So the reason I'm not testing with a dead animal, and I could do that, I could go out to one of the hunting blocks I go to and go and shoot at dead animals, go and hunt some animals, hang them up and shoot them, is because there's varying densities in an animal. And what I see mentioned a lot online is that an actual animal is always going to be the best indicator of penetration, and that's not correct if we're trying to measure differences, because an animal has varying densities all of the way through it. So at no time will one arrow experience exactly the same resistance as another arrow, because by default you'll be hitting the animal in a different part of its body, and so the material the arrows had to go through will be different. And the hardest point on an arrow, on an animal, I think everybody will agree, will be the shoulder, the front shoulder, particularly on pigs. I hear it mentioned a lot when we're talking penetration for things, that the front shoulder of a pig is the hardest, most densest part. It's got the fighting pad, it's got the shoulder bone, this, that, and the other. If I was going to shoot at a pig, right, at the densest spot, and seek to use that as my target medium, I would want to have a target that was the same density and going to provide the same resistance as that hardest part of the pig's front shoulder, all over the target, all the way through the target, so that two arrows that I would be shooting into it side by side would have to go through the same amount of resistance, right? I can't sort of just aim at a shoulder and expect that a different part of the shoulder, because no doubt I'm not going to hit exactly next to my arrow and go through exactly the same amount of bone density and exactly the same amount of biological material, because it's going to be shifted over to another point. And so the resistance that that arrow has to go through would be different. Okay, so if we're wanting to get credible measurements, then we have to be shooting through a material that is uniform, so that we have accurate results. So they're the benefits of this target material, and that's why I've chosen to go with it for the test. I believe it's going to give us uniform readings, so no matter where I hit on this target, the arrows are going to experience exactly the same amount of resistance. The cost for this target, as I've said, so I buy like 8 blocks of 4 sheets, and it costs me about, plus the tape, the electrical tape, it costs me about, $90. So yeah, so I don't know, I might have helped a few hunters out on saving a bit of money on targets. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing, I'm not sure. But yeah, the next thing we'll do is I'll introduce you guys to my range here, and it's a simple range. I'll just grab the camera and we will go through it. Alright, so this is the range that we're going to be shooting on today. This is my backyard range. There's Billy. So we've got timber pegs hammered into the ground 5 yards apart, all the way out to 35 yards. I've measured all of these with my rangefinder. As you can hear, the wind's picking up a little bit, so we might have to put the practical off until perhaps this afternoon when it's died down a little. But yeah, that's the general gist of it. And again, I don't think I paid anything for this. Maybe just the chalk spray, just some chunks of timber, just random chunks of timber cut off and hammered into the ground at those distances. Right, so that's the hunting range we're going to be using. I haven't had my range set up like that forever, and it's not just for recreational shooting at different distances. I actually used that range set up in 5-yard increments out to 35 as a pretty rigorous training regime before my first hunt of the year. So it usually goes for about a month, and I'll shoot at those in one session. Usually takes me about half an hour, but I'll start at 35, work my way back into 15 yards, and then work my way back out to 35 yards again, taking 2 shots at every station, one standing, one kneeling. And what that'll allow me to do is that by the time my first hunt rolls around, I've had lots of experience shooting for an animal to walk up or present itself to me at any one of those distances. I don't need to stuff around. I can take an instinctive shot, because I've taken so many shots at those distances that I've got a good visual record of how far away that animal is. I've got lots of experience shooting the animal at all the different distances within 35 yards, and that's what the purpose of that is. Why it's out to 35 yards, I'll go into in another video. So I will set up another video at a later date disclosing that training regime, so that anyone who doesn't have one can perhaps benefit from it. Like if there's any hunters out there that are wondering how to prepare for their first hunt, or they just, existing hunters that, have spent a lot of time out in the field, that perhaps want to work on that element of their archery before a hunt, they might benefit from that video. But I'll go into more detail on the range and how I use it in another video, is what I'm saying. But the reason it's set up out to 35 yards only actually stems back to how I used to train when I first got into archery. And when I first got into archery, I had the idea that if I could shoot accurately out to really long distances, I'd never need to sneak up on an animal. I'd be able to just take a really long, accurate shot. It would never know I was there. It'd never hear me. And then I don't like I'd be a sniper with a bow, basically. So I bought like magnification lenses. I had all the gear. I had the wind checkers. I had a single pin adjustable sight with a sight tape on it, the range finder, and spent lots of time taking really long shots. And then when I took that plan out to the field, it didn't work. So, I would spend a lot of time dicking around with my rangefinder, playing around with my sight wheel, and then with my air puffer, seeing, how much wind drift I was going to get. And by the time I'd stuffed around with all those things, the animal had moved, and then I'd have to do the process over again, and the whole exercise became extremely frustrating. With, sometimes I vividly remember getting in contact with an animal that I felt was too close. Like that's a thing, and retreating back to a distance where I felt like I could sneak out of there, and then I'd be less noticeable and take a longer shot. I mean, that's how little understanding I had when I first started, and that was probably back around 2018, 2019. I just figured out that approach to things just wasn't going to work. So another thing I noticed on those first few hunts was that the encounters I was having with animals were actually much closer than what I expected. So as a new hunter, that's one of the things that I noticed when I did get in contact with animals, was that I was actually coming into contact with them walking around out in the bush much closer than the ranges that I was training at. So, and usually the shots that I was being presented with were between the 20 and 30 yard mark. So that impacted how I trained for archery and how I set my bows up for bow hunting, to basically sort of encouraged me to where I'm at today. And it's purely developed through experience in the field, as to why I don't really bother training at distances further than that. I have shot animals out at like 45 yards and stuff like that, but what I've found is in the bush, I've always got the opportunity to get closer. It's always a lot easier for me to get closer than to try and take a potentially unsuccessful shot out at a greater distance. It just seems like after having experience in the bush, it just seems like the choice to get closer makes it so that I'm more likely to get an animal on the ground as to, taking that risk and taking a longer shot. It just always serves me better to get closer, and so my training is around taking shots closer to the animals compared to some of those longer shots that I used to take, and it's all 35 yards and in for me these days. So like I said, the encounters that I usually get with animals out in the field, and I'm hoping that this will be seconded by most other hunters out there, is that the most common range for me to take shots at is about the 25-yard mark. It does vary, but I just feel like that's a safe distance, that most of the encounters that people would get out there would be at around that range. Obviously you can get closer than that, and the closer you get the better, but I just find that 25-yard mark for me is going to provide us a good distance for the practical that we're going to do today. So that's why I'll be placing the target at 25 yards, because I feel like that distance is a good representation of the distance that is most commonly shot or commonly presented out in the field. So having explained what the target material is made out of, and how it's constructed, and explained the distance that we're going to be shooting at, showing you guys the range, I think it's about time that we got into the practical. First off, I wanted to say that what our expectations are here. So our expectations are that we've added extra weight to one of our arrows, we've done the maths, and the arrow with the greater mass has the greater momentum. And so by default, we're going to be expecting that this arrow with the greater mass and the greater momentum is going to out-penetrate the lighter arrow. The whole exercise is based around that. It's based around improving the performance of our arrows by adding mass to them. And that's what we're expecting to see. We're expecting to see an increase in performance from this heavier arrow. So we'll get into it. I'm going to film this in a continuous scene, so you know there's no camera trickery. I'm just going to film it from behind me here as I shoot, and then after I've shot the 2 arrows, I'll take the camera over to the target with a tape measure, and we'll measure them. Then we'll bring the camera back, and we will do some maths to work out the penetrations of both arrows. And I'll do all of that in a continuous scene, so that you can see that there's not been any editing and our results are trustworthy. The other thing that I'm going to cover is where I'm going to be aiming. So the first arrow I'm going to shoot will be the lighter one, and I'm just going to aim at a top region of the target. Right, so I'll be aiming somewhere here, and then what I'm going to do with the heavier arrow is I'm actually going to aim at the back of the first arrow. I'm certain that this one is going to drop because it's got heavier mass. It's a heavier arrow, so I'm just going to aim it straight at the back of the first one, and we're going to have a good visual representation of how much arrow drop we're to expect at 25 yards as well with the heavier arrow. So that being said, I think it's time to get into the practical. Okay. Alright. So I'll just put this target up on the bin here. And we'll have a chat about our results. So I think first we'll measure them. So the top one is the light arrow. And we have 44 centimeters. I'll just double measure that one. We'll say 44.3. And for the second arrow, 45.5. So 45.5. I'll just verify that with the camera here. Okay. I don't know if you guys can see that, but it's 44.3 centimeters, and the second arrow was 45.5. Hopefully you guys can see that, 45.5 and 44.3. Yeah. So we're just going to go over to our paperwork here and do some maths so that we can get a an accurate measurement for penetration. Alright, so we're up here, just I'm going to do the penetration maths for the test. Before we do that, I just wanted to show you guys quickly the drop that I expected to see. I think that's quite a lot of drop for 25 yards. This top arrow, like as I'm sure everyone already knows, that the lighter arrows fly flatter, but the amount of drop that the heavier arrow received from just adding 150 grains is like, yeah, it's about 7 inches. Yeah, it's about 7 inches worth of drop there. If your bow was set up to use the heavier arrow, obviously, what you'd be looking at there for the significance of arrow drop is that, you know, like I said to you, I was just aiming my red dot right there through my sight. And if my bow was tuned into the heavier arrow, at 25 yards it would still hit there. But where this arrow drop makes a difference is that it's purely a reflection of a loss in arrow speed. So this arrow is just flying significantly slower, and that's what's resulted in it having a lower trajectory. But ultimately, the only thing that is going to affect when you're out hunting is the forgiveness of your bow setup. So, if I had my bow tuned to this heavier one and I put my red dot here and just aimed here with it, if the target was, like further away or closer, and I took the same shot, essentially what I would be seeing is if it was a little bit further away and I didn't adjust my bow sights to take the shot, essentially it would just hit lower than where I was aiming. And with a heavier arrow, when you're losing trajectory like that, your arrow, the arc of your arrow isn't as flat. It just means that you're going to need more pins, or you're going to need to be more accurate with your range finding. And like with the scenario that I covered earlier, which has encouraged me to shoot at closer distances, you'll see that the benefits of doing that for me are that it cuts down the amount of errors and the amount of time that it takes me to acquire a target out in the field. Like, I don't need to spend as much time playing around with my sights, but if I did shoot, say, a heavier arrow, the need for me to be more switched on with my aiming would start to creep back in. Like, the more fiddly I would have to be with my target, with my bow sights, which for me are incredibly simple. It's just a single pin sight that does not move. Like, this is locked in, my adjustment wheel, it doesn't move. So with the heavier arrow, it just means that I would not be able to shoot a setup like this anymore. Even for these closer distances, these 35-yard shots and stuff, I would have to have a movable wheel again, or have multiple pin sights, so that I could keep or hold on to that accuracy and allow for this much of a trajectory loss. But that's just something I wanted to point out. We'll go back over here to the results of the test. So this was the piece of paper that we looked at in the last video, which was how we did our calculations to work out just how much extra momentum this heavier 550 grain arrow ended up with. So as we can see by the results here, we have the lighter arrow has a momentum reading of 0.5346 foot-pounds per second. Slugs per second, because we're measuring in slugs, sorry. So it had 0.5346, and the heavier one had 0.5928. So 0.59, this one had 0.53. So this one has the less momentum. The lighter arrow had a less momentum, but when we ran it through the equation, and the heavier one had a higher momentum. And so we were expecting this one to have greater penetration. So if we go down to our penetration calculations, this first value, so I'll just get my pen out here. This first value here represents the total arrow length, right? So that's the total amount of arrow length available for penetration. And as you probably heard in other videos that cover this topic, we can't measure penetration unless the target actually arrests the arrow. If it's a pass-through, then there's no penetration to measure. So it needs to stop in the target, and the target needs to be of a uniform material so that we can obtain this measurement. And it has to be a uniform material all over the target, so that both arrows experience exactly the same amount of resistance when they hit the target, right? And therefore, that's going to allow us to get an accurate reading here, an accurate reading for the amount of penetration each arrow provided. So when we took our measurements, we measured from the side of penetration, right, to the tail, to the very tip of the nock, right, and that was the amount of arrow that was left outside the target. Okay, and we took those readings. So to get an accurate reading of how much arrow is in the target, we would simply subtract this much of the arrow from the total length of the arrow to get what's left inside it. So For the first arrow measurement, I went over here and I wrote down the measurements corresponding to each arrow weight. And to work out how much is inside the target, we simply take our initial arrow length and minus it from how much is left out of the target. So if we go over here to the calculator, we will go 74.5 minus 44.3. This is an internet calculator, so it's lagging a little bit. And we get 30.2. So if we go over here, equals 30.2 centimeters, right, of penetration. And then we'll go to the heavier arrow. We'll just clear off the calculator, and we'll go 74.5 minus 45.5. 45.5 equals 29. Okay, so 29 centimeters. Okay. That concludes the part of today's video where we are recording the results. The next part is that we're going to have a discussion on our results. So I'm just going to pack all of this stuff away. I'm going to go take a seat and run through the results with you. Right. So that's a bit of an eye-opener, I would think. The results of the test have clearly shown that their heavier arrow had less penetration than the lighter arrow. And all we did was add 150 grains, and it's both arrows were shot out of a 70-pound bow. And yeah, the difference between the two is, I would say, negligible. So I've increased the weight of the second arrow by a pretty significant amount. It's 150 grains heavier, and our maths indicated that it was going to give us extra momentum, but that extra momentum doesn't seem to have yielded us any penetration over the initial arrow. All it seems to have done, if I'm just purely discussing the results here, is decrease the trajectory performance of the arrow. So the top arrow flies a lot flatter and it penetrates more by 1.2 centimeters. So that's not a lot of penetration gain, but that was our original arrow, my original arrow setup, and the second one was the so-called improved version of it by adding mass. The goal of which was to increase the penetration. It hasn't done that. It's decreased its penetrating power, and it's actually made my arrow less accurate because it's not flying as straight as the top one. It's not flying as flat, and it's not as fast. They're the results of the momentum test, and I think we can see in the results of the velocity here that the 550 grain arrow was flying a lot slower. So the lighter one was flying at 297 feet per second, and the heavier one was flying at 247 feet per second. So it's a much slower arrow, by about 50 feet per second, roughly. I think that is exactly 50 feet per second, actually. And it only had marginally more momentum. Like I think if you increased it by perhaps another 100 grains, I think it would invariably increase its momentum. Again, if you wanted to give it even more momentum by increasing the weight of it. But I think what you'd find is that it's the negative effects of flight are going to compound even more greatly. So you're going to have a very poorly performing arrow compared to the lighter one. And I just don't see that there's going to be much benefit in penetrative power by increasing the weight further, even further than that. This was simply just to demonstrate what adding 150 grains might do for your arrow setup. And I could confidently say that increasing momentum by just increasing weight probably isn't going to yield us nearly as much benefit as if we went back to our equation. So we'll go back to the equation for momentum. And as we can see on the equation, to increase momentum, it's mass times velocity. And momentum, it says in its definition, is a linear function of velocity. So if you double the velocity, you double the momentum. So what that calls for mathematically, if you ask me, is that we need to increase velocity as well. So velocity in terms of momentum acts as a bit of a multiplier as far as I've come to understand. You can increase the mass of something and yes, you will increase its momentum that way, but far less effectively than if you increased velocity as well. So if you increased velocity as well, it's just going to give you a much higher reading for momentum. And by default, if you increase velocity, you're also going to increase the performance of the arrow. So if we go back to the results of our test, showing that just simply adding 150 grains to our arrow doesn't give us extra penetration, there are two questions. One is, well, what's the explanation then for it not out-penetrating the lighter arrow if it has more momentum? If it has more momentum, why hasn't it out-penetrated the light arrow? And the second question is, what do we have to do to the heavier arrow in order to get it to outperform the lighter arrow? So what's caused it to perform poorly? What's caused the lighter arrow to perform better? And how can we more effectively increase the performance of our arrows? Now this is, as I've said before, I'm already shooting a 70 pound bow, which is the highest poundage that we typically get in Australia. You can get heavier poundage bows to increase the velocity, but typically a high poundage compound bow in Australia is normally a 70 pound bow. You can get heavier ones. You can order special limbs and all of that sort of thing to take advantage of higher poundage. Higher poundage doesn't always equate to extra velocity though. If you're buying a bow based on how much velocity it's going to offer, you want to pay attention to the IBO specs, the IBO rating being the IBO feet per second of the bow. So as I said, my compound bow is a 345 foot per second bow, and I don't know, man. A lot of the bows that I see on the market are not quite that high. They're normally, some of the higher end bows, modern bows, are creeping sort of back up to there, but even still towards that foot per second, it's usually between 315, somewhere around there normally for some of the bows. But to having them as a higher foot per second with its IBO rating at around 345 is like, it's not very common. So I actually had to go out of my way to try and find a bow or pick a bow that's going to have the high foot per second, and they're usually sold to guys that are fundamentally trying to get a speed bow. So it's like a speed bow. What I've chosen isn't for that. I've chosen a 345 foot per second bow, or buying a bow with a higher potential output for speed. Simply gives you a wider range of of output speeds for you to use. You don't have to have it dialed all the way up to 70 pounds to get a lot of foot per second speed. You can dial it back and shoot 60 pounds and still get quite a lot of speed out of the bow, and it has to do with the engineering mechanics of the bow, which has enabled you to get that higher foot per second speed out of your bow setup. So there are what I'm saying is there are other 70-pound bows out there that don't have an equal amount of velocity output as my bow does. So and it's based, again, it's based on what the set IBO rating of your bow is, and if you've got it dialed all the way to the max, 70 pounds, that's going to be the most amount of foot per second output your bow can provide your arrow, if that makes sense. So in our next video, I'm going to be exploring, as I said, potential reasons as to why this top lighter arrow here may have experienced more penetration or provided more penetration than the heavier one. And I think that's going to be a really interesting video for all of you hunters out there to pay attention to, and yeah, I'm looking forward to delving into that. The video will be largely around the idea of exploring kinetic energy, and yeah, like there'll be a second video after that which I'll explore with you guys different considerations for target materials and essentially what all of this information means to you when it comes to buying your equipment, or what to expect out of your equipment, particularly if you're using trad bows. You know, how can we apply this sort of science to them, considering they shoot at much lower velocities than a compound bow does. I'm going to be delving into all of that with the next couple of videos, but the very next video we'll be going into perhaps explaining as to how this occurred. If momentum, increasing the momentum of our arrows isn't giving us extra penetration, then what potentially will? I'm also going to include information on the bottom of this video as to again, all the equipment that I used, where to find it, so that you guys can sort of do some of this stuff at home. Again, everything that I'm doing here it's relatively cheap and inexpensive. It's not a lot of effort. I mean, if you can build a range in your backyard like that, I told you it didn't cost me anything. This is all stuff that I'm trying to encourage other hunters to do. So you guys watching, I feel like it's not difficult to do. You guys could go out there and do this without me rambling on. You guys don't have to do any of their talking. You can just set all of this up and you could probably have it done in one afternoon. So anyway, look forward to doing the next video with you guys and hope you've enjoyed it.